Link on the email also. Okay. Okay. So the topic, right? Some of you may have been wondering is exactly how does it connect to this week's parsha. That's the whole. The idea of this particular series is to dubbed Parshut HaShavua, to take a halachic topic and connect it to the Parshat Shavua. So what is going into churches and going into other, or in general, hopefully we'll reach not only churches but other non-Jewish houses of worship. What does that have to do with this week's Parshat VaEra? We're smack in the middle of the of Yetziat Mitzrayim, beginning of the Makot, etc. So here there's an interesting understanding of Chazal. Not that any other understanding of Chazal isn't interesting, but this one is relevant in particular. That on the Psukim towards the end of the Parsha, where the Parsha ends with Makat Barad, with hail, and we have the following vignette. Vayishlach Paro, first source here, Vayikra Moshe Aaron. So Paro calls Moshe and Aharon. The damage of the Barad, we just went through a storm, so we can understand this as well, and the Barad is not. It's not stopping. Vayomer alehem chatati apam. So this time I have sinned. Hashem atzadik, va'ani va'ami harishaim. Hashem is correct. Hashem is righteous. I and my people are rishaim. Hatiru el Hashem, pray to God. V'rav miot kolot Elokim uvarad, va'ashalecha etchem v'lo tosifun la'amod. So pray to God, and so that that all of the rumblings of God and the hail will stop, and I will send you, and you will not be here anymore. Vayomer elav Moshe. So Moshe answers, "Ketsati et ha'ir." When I leave the city, efros et kapay el Hashem. So I will lift up my hands to God. Hakolot yechdalun. The thunder, the lightning will cease. Habarad lo yeh, and there will be no more hail. Leman teda ki lashem haaretz. In order that you understand that God has dominion over the world. Okay. So the question is, why does Moshe have to leave town? Ketsati et ha'ir. Why can't he just simply say, "Okay, I'll go and pray"? So the Ramban gives his understanding of Pshat, and he says that Moshe normally davened at home, but this time he wants to have a more public type of, or a more demonstrative type of tefillah, lifting up his hands as in prayer, and so he feels that it is better to do this outside of town. That's one understanding. And then he says, Rabotenu Amrum. This is the second paragraph of Roman numeral 2. Rabotenu Amrum, in the Mechilta, in Midrash Halacha there, Shelo haya mitpalel betoch ha'ir, lefi shehi meleya gilulim. V'chol shechen shelo haya nidaber imo ela chutz lekrach. So that it's that all of the dialogue that takes place between Moshe and God does not take place within the city. Doesn't take place within the metropolitan area of which Paro is living, because the town is chock full of avodah zarah. In other words, that Moshe cannot pray to God when he's surrounded by these by these idols and by these temples and the like. So now the question is, why does the Torah have to reveal this? In other words, this is sort of the unspoken theme throughout according to this. But here, the Ramban explains in Kein Nomar, and therefore, based on this, I have to explain further. Ki ba'avur shaya Paro mevakesh ata sheyasur barad miyad. Well, normally Paro has no inkling or perhaps no interest in knowing how Moshe communicates with God, etc. But now he's asking and demanding that that there be an immediate cessation of hostilities. And so Moshe has to pray. He even says, Hatiru el Hashem, go pray to God. So Moshe has to explain why there's going to be a bit of a delay. He has to leave town in order to make that tefillah. And the Ramban concludes with V'hu ha'emet. And this is the truth. Well, it's from the Ramban's perspective, even though he had given a perush of the, which he felt was originally closer to the pshat, to understanding it. But once he takes what Chazal said and perhaps adds one little layer as to explain why Moshe has to notify Paro at this particular moment, he believes that this is the explanation which strikes closest to the truth. Okay, this is the Ramban. So that's the tie-in. In other words, here you have a situation. The question is, okay, so that's because here, by the way, just to keep it in mind, right, Moshe's not going into the temple of Ra. I don't know, along those lines. So it's he's not going into any particular pagan temple, God forbid. So, but he's basically saying the entire environment, so the entire city has become polluted and contaminated because of the avodah zarah that's found there. I'm sorry? Okay. Right, so the Makom Tameh, but wouldn't you understand Makom Tameh being the entire city?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can write the Midrash. Great, fantastic. I mean, so I'm not disagreeing with you, Chas v'Shalom. But so this would have so let's see how the halacha develops here. So the Mishnah already. This is I don't know why it was left out here. It's the first parak of Avodah Zarah, the Mishnah Dalet. It just says Mishnah Dalet and Avodah Zarah. So it's the first parak. Ir sheyesh ba Avodah Zarah. So a city with Avodah Zarah in its midst. Chutz ala mutar. So outside of the city is permissible. Haya chutz ala Avodah Zarah. Tocha mutar. If there is outside of this particular city, presumably what it means is that there's some temple, right, or temples. And so if the temples are found inside the city, so the outside of the city, right, the suburbs, as it were, are permissible. And if the temple is outside the city, then inside the city is permissible. Mahu, what does it mean to be permissible? Mahu lelech l'sham. What about going through the city? It seems as though that what basically the Mishnah is saying is that if there is a temple to Avodah Zarah in the city, it's forbidden to live there, forbidden to be there. To the extent that Ma'u lelech l'sham, what about going to that city, visiting that city? Bizman shaderech miyuchedet loto makom asur. So if you are going on a road which is the I don't know, Derech Yafo, right? And that's where you're heading towards Yafo, and Yafo has that particular Avodah Zarah, so then you can't go in. It doesn't seem to mean that you can't be on the entire highway. It means it's going through the city into on that road, even though you're just passing through. V'im haya yachol lahalech ba lemakom acher mutar. But if it happens to be that road, that highway, it goes through the city, so then it's permissible to take the highway. Okay, in other words, that's the Mishnah. The Gemara expands a little bit on this, and the Gemara says, and it also puts it into a slightly different context, or I shouldn't say different context. It explains the context. Tanu Rabbanan, Ir sheyesh ba'avoda kochavim, asur likanes letocha, v'lo mitocha le'ir acheret. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that if there's an avodah zarah in the city, you can't go into the city at all. Right? You can't use that city as a base. So, I mean, I'm not quite sure what it means. That lo mitocha le'ir acheret means that if you're already there, you can't leave. It means that you can't be using it as a hub to get to a different place.
A hub or a pastor.
Or a pastor, right.
So we have Rehov Yaffo here, and it ends at Yaffo.
Right.
We say Yaffo has the Avodah Zarah. We cannot take Rehov Yaffo.
No, so I don't think that he's saying that you litocha, into the city, not on the road. But no, you can't. But basically, Rabbi Meir seems to be saying that even if, let's say, Rehov Yaffo, or let's say Derech Hebron. Okay, so Derech Hebron, right, which is Kvish Shishim, so is the main hill route of Eretz Yisrael, right? So you take Kvish Shishim, you go from Hebron, you can go south from there to Beersheba, you can go north to Yerushalayim, to Shechem, etc. So if you're on Derech Hebron, and Hebron is the problem, so what Rabbi Meir is saying is you can't go to Hebron and pass through Hebron to get to Beersheba either. Okay, that's the idea. The Chachamim omrim kol zman shahaderech miyuchedet lo'oto makom asur, ein haderech miyuchedet lo'oto makom mutar. In other words, so if the terminus is that place, so let's say Yaffo, right? Because after that it's just the sea. So then if it's Yaffo, so then you can't go to Yaffo. But if it's even though obviously there are other routes outside of Yaffo, but if it is part of a road network, so then it's permissible. And the Breita continues just to, I don't know why the bold didn't come out here, but Yashav lo kotz bifnei avoda kachavim. Something which doesn't seem to be at all connected. But this is, if I get a splinter in my foot and I'm standing before some idol, lo yishchev yitlena, I shouldn't lean over to remove that splinter, that thorn, mipnei shenireh kemishtachaveh l'avoda kachavim. Right? Because it appears as though I am bowing down to the idol. V'imeno nireh, but if it doesn't have that appearance, then mutar. And then there are a few other examples. If you drop some change along the same lines, or there's a fountain right in front of the idol, which was kind of which was pretty common. So if it seems as though that you're drinking, that you are bowing down to the idol, so then it's forbidden. And if it is something which is doesn't give that appearance, so then it's mutar. So in context, why is this particular halacha? I mean, we understand that second halacha, right? It's also made famous by this story of Hannah and her 7 sons and the last son, etc. Mordechai and Haman, perhaps, etc. But what's the connection to the first halacha? So presumably it's the same idea. And that's how Rashi understands it. I didn't bring the Rashi here. In other words, that basically it's giving the impression that you are going to that place because of the avodah zarah. As if which is already, if that's the understanding, you can see there's a bit of a loophole here, where that if you are not giving that impression, perhaps that's the exact machloket between Rabbi Meir and the second dayad. As Rabbi Meir says, no, you're going to the city is polluted, you can't go in there, period. And the Chachamim are saying, no, it's a question of the impression that you're making. So if it seems as though you're going to this city, right, and it's still a pretty broad net, right? It's not saying, oh, there happens to be a pagan temple there, right? No, that's does that mean it's I think every city, every town had its local deity. Right? So if that means you can't go into any pagan town, does it mean that it's a place where there is, if let's say I'm going to, and then we'll get to Christianity in a moment, but I'm just say for argument's sake, right, you know what? Forget about Christianity. The Pantheon. Okay, so you're going to Rome, right? When the Pantheon was a Pantheon. Right, when it had in each of those niches, it had an idol, and it is the remarkable temple of Rome. So if you're going to Rome, so everyone assumes you're going to the Pantheon. Right, that's the situation. Whereas if if it just happens to be that there happens to be the pagan version of a shtibel right there, right? So then it's okay. Right, it's not a big deal. Or no, it means that if there is along the lines of what the medrash that we had seen before, that the very virtue of the fact that there is pagan worship here in this particular locale, that contaminates the entire city. And you can't. And if you're a good Jew, you're not going to go into that place. Right? You don't go where there's avodah zarah there. The Rambam in his Perush HaMishnah, it's interesting. He doesn't say this, at least that I'm familiar with, in the Mishnah Torah. He brings this halacha in the Mishnah Torah in a very straightforward manner in terms of not going into the town if there's a city. But then in the Parshu HaMishnah, which predated the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says the following. This is number 3, and I said I don't know why in these first sources the bold just didn't come out in the print here. But anyway, אמרו מה ללך לשם שעשינו אותו דרך ללך משם לזולתו לפי שאסור להיכנס לעיר שיש בה עבודת כוכבים כל שכן לדור בה, so you can't go into the city, all the more so it's forbidden to live in that city, וכל שכן, and even more so לסחור בה, to do business in that city, וחנויות מאותרות, right? Because the stores have decorations, right? It's sort of like Christmas decorations in the stores, that they're still up in most cities around the world. Chanuyot ha'ir shemiyafinotam be'eze min miminei hanoi she'asa kol hu lavodat kochavim, because the commerce is being dedicated to those idols, and therefore it's asur. But then the Rambam says the following. Skip a few lines. The last 3 lines, in the middle of the third to last line, it says "Aval anachnu tachat yedeihem." Right. So we are under the domination of the goy, ba'avonotenu, in our due to our sins. V'shochnim ba'artzam, and we dwell in their lands. Anusim, against our will. V'nitkayem banu ma shene'emar, and as a result, the pasuk which we read on Tisha B'Av actually. V'avadtem sham Elohim acherim ma'aseh yadei adam eitz va'ever. Right, that you will worship when you are taken away, when there will be this exile, and you will worship foreign gods, right? So the Rambam is alluding to the drasha of Chazal, not that you are going to, God forbid, be bowing down to Zeus, but rather that because you are subservient to those who worship Zeus, or whatever its equivalent is, Marduk, let's say, in Persia, right? So then you're Mordechai, right? Then you have then you, by extension, are Ovdei Avodah Zarah, because you are subservient to Ovdei Avodah Zarah. So that's what the Rambam is saying with our great sins, right? And he's referring, we'll see, he's referring to Christian Europe, right? Less so to Islam, but nevertheless, that we are under there. So even though it's forbidden for us to be in these cities, but we don't have a choice. We are exiled, and so as a result, we have to live there. Ve'im, then the Rambam adds, which is not explicit in the Gemara, but the Rambam gives us basically a halachic insight here. Ve'im ha'ir dina ken. If this is the din with regard to the city, kal v'chomer din beit avodat kochavim atzmo, shu asur lanu kimat lirota, v'chol sheken likanes bo. In other words, if this is the extent that the halacha demands of us, that we're not allowed to go into a locale with avodah zarah, so all the more so is with regard to the temple itself, that we can't even kimat lirota, right? It's forbidden even to glance at it, and all the more so to enter the temple. And basically what the Rambam is doing here is sort of saying, okay, we are stuck living in Rome, but that doesn't mean we have to do what the Romans do, right? That doesn't mean that, okay, so to the extent that you can avoid the temples. To the extent that you can, and certainly under no circumstance should you be going into the temples, right? No, it's the idea that without getting into the development of the minhag, to spit at a church and things along those lines, right? Going through the through the centuries, but that's the spirit of the Rambam here. Okay, it's that type of thing. Yeah.
So this seems pretty extreme, because when we look at all of the examples, let's say in the Avot, Yosef, was he not? He was the viceroy of Egypt.
Right.
Avram Avinu obviously had relations with, Goyim and the paganism of his time as well. Even Moshe Rabbeinu grew up there, although it could be you say, well, this source here that you quoted at the beginning, sort of Moshe Rabbeinu has evolved. But it seems that how can we ignore those examples of the Avot that had all those, Yosef?
Okay, so again, Yosef certainly taken
extreme.
Okay, so now you can easily, though, I think, explain the things that are in those stories that you're referring to, right? Based on again, this halacha is a derabanan. Okay, it's not I should stress that. It's not, it's if you are going into the city, and probably even going into the temple itself. So you're not worshiping. What is, if I just to use the example that the Braita itself gave, if I dropped my wallet and I bend over to pick it up, and it looks as though I'm bowing down, am I over avodah zarah by doing that? No, it gives the impression. So giving the impression isn't the Isser D'Oraita, right? But it's saying this is how careful I need to be in terms of distancing myself from avodah zarah. All right? In other words, it is anathema to us, and when things are anathema to you, you don't go near them. Right? That is the if it's not anathema, it's just an Isser, if you will. Think about it this way, just to give a very simple psychological parallel. Okay, it's not identical, but it's parallel, right? So going into a non-kosher establishment to get a drink, to get a cup of coffee. Okay, so you don't have to put your show of hands, but you can, right? It's audio, it's not video. So it's to go into, without getting into the question of, is Starbucks kosher? The Starbucks, whatever. Okay? Right? How many people here will go into a Starbucks to get a cup of coffee? Right? There's lots of things that are sold there that aren't kosher. Right? But you gotta go into the Starbucks. How many people feel comfortable going into a McDonald's to get the same cup of coffee? Right? Now, there's absolutely no difference halachically between walking into the McDonald's and walking into the Starbucks to get the same cup of coffee if it's kosher. Right? Absolutely no difference. What? So what is Maris Ayin? Right? How is it Maris Ayin? Because, so the answer is that it's Maris Ayin because of it, we have almost something visceral about going into a a non-kosher establishment like McDonald's, whereas even though I could just as easily buy, glatt treif at the in the Starbucks, or in a museum cafeteria, or in the convenience store at the gas station, whatever it is, I can be buying the exact same tarfus, but everyone understands, okay, if he sees me going in, he's getting a cup of coffee, he's getting a Coke, or whatever it is. If I go into the McDonald's, suddenly what? I'm getting a Coke? I'm not getting a Coke? Right? I'm going to be getting a Big Mac? No, right? But there's some. It's not just the Marisai, it's it's in our kishkas, right? That's the feeling, right? That the Gemara is saying you should feel about avodah zarah, right? There's avodah zarah, right? So it's something which is visceral that you just can't come near it. You can't even be in the same city with it. Is that an Isha d'oraita? No. So when it comes to Yosef, and when it comes to the Avot, etc. So the fact, you take a look at, maybe that's the reason why Abraham doesn't live in the cities. He lives, he distances himself for the most part. Maybe that's why Yosef decides it's very important for the Jewish people to live in Goshen, right? Where they're not involved directly in the Egyptian culture. In other words, all of this is, Yosef is there, he doesn't have a choice. Right? He was first enslaved. He's now been elevated. He has a job to do. He's the court Jew, as it were. Right? Many parallels is well known between Megillat Esther and the Yosef story. That's also part of it. It's the Jew in the Golah. Right? So there are certain accommodations that need to be made. Right? But at the same time, there are lines that need to be drawn, even if those lines are red lines that are occasionally crossed. Right? And we'll talk about other examples of that halacha l'maaseh. So here, the question now is, okay, that's back in the day of paganism. And I would, I guess another follow-up shir should be Eastern religions. Right? And, where it seems to be like the good old school paganism, right? Is that a bigger is it a problem to be going to various places in the Far East and the like, and visiting, etc. Or not? But that's beyond the scope right now of this year. I want to focus on Western religions. And primarily the so-called, not so-called, we'll say the monotheistic religions that we're familiar with. Is there a problem, and to what extent is there a problem in terms of halacha? So the Rambam, taking this within the context of these Mishnayot, in the same parish of Mishnah, in the Mishnah before the quote that we just said, the Rambam says the following: Vida. Shizot ha'umah hanotzrit. Understand that this Christian religion, ha'omedet b'tanat ha'mashiach al chiluf kitoteha, right, and with regard to their claim of the Messiah, regardless of their various sects. Now here, I'm not familiar enough with what sects the Rambam is referring to. What sects was he familiar with? My guess is that he's speaking about the Coptics as opposed to what would later be called the Catholics. Catholics were only called Catholics after the Protestant Reformations, a few hundred years later, and perhaps the Orthodox, the Eastern, the Byzantine Church, the Eastern Church as opposed to the Western Church. No, so I don't know whether, how detailed the Rambam's understanding of Christianity is or was with regard to the various sects at that point. However, Kulam, the Rambam says, Ovdei Avodah Zarah. All of these sects are Avodah Zarah ve'edehen, and their holidays, Kulam Asurim, and doing business with them on their holidays, which we'll see in a moment, which the Mishnah had forbidden. with regard to paganism. So is forbidden with the Christians as well. Right? Rambam just says there is a full equality, no, just cut and paste. Pagan, Christian, anytime it says goy in the Gemara, you can just paste in Christian there. Okay, it's the same thing, no difference. Okay, that's the Rambam's approach. And then in a few decades later, when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, and you can see how the censor impacted on it. The original text is Hanotzrim, here in source number 5, Perek Tet Halacha Daled. The original text read Notzrim. The censors, because the censorship generally happened only after the printing press, and then you had mass. You were able to have much greater oversight of what was going on in the printing presses. But so that was changed to Hakna'anim of De Avodah Zarah. Right? And that is something which is very common in many different places. But Hanotzrim of De Avodah Zarah hem v'yom harishon hu yom edam. And as a result, the Rambam says Sunday is a holiday for them. Right? Every Sunday is the Sabbath. Lefikach asur latet laset imahem be'eretz Yisrael yom chamishi v'yom shishi shebechol Shabbat v'Shabbat ve'ein tzarich lomar yom rishon atzmo shu asur bechol makom v'chein noagin imayim bechol eidehem. Whereas the Mishnah had said that it's forbidden to do business 3 days, and according to the Rambam's being makel here. The Rambam, there's a Mishnah there's a shita that says you can't do 3 days after as well. But basically, that you're not supposed to do business. Why? Because the non-Jew will thank his god or gods for the business that was done, or will dedicate it on the holiday to the god. So therefore, the Mishnah says you can't do business a few days before their holidays. And the Mishnah was talking about a few times in the year. Right? The Rambam says, well, the Christians, by having co-opted Shabbat, turning it into Sunday, so they basically have made a holiday every week, which means you can't do business with them. The Rambam limits it here without getting to why in Eretz Yisrael alone, but still, basically, in principle, you cannot do business, right? If you're taking the Machmir Shita, you can't do business with Christians ever, basically, because every week has this holiday. Right, that's the Rambam. Now, the Rambam can get away with that because the Rambam is living in a Muslim country. We're going to see what the Balei Tosfot, who are living in Crusader Europe, what they did with this halakha. They're also familiar with it. We'll get to that in a moment. Before we do that, it's important to note that the Rambam also takes if you will, that's on the micro level. The Rambam also takes if you will, a step back and takes a look at least philosophically speaking, on the macro level as well. And the Rambam here, it's not in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, it's in Hilchot Melachim. It's towards the end of the Mishnah Torah in its entirety, where the Rambam ends with discussion of the Yemot HaMashiach, and there the Rambam says the following. He says, Af Yeshu Hanotzri. So even Jesus, Shadama Shahaya Mashiach v'Herag b'Beitin, who thought of himself as the Messiah and was killed in Beitin. Okay, I'm not going to get into the question now who killed him. Kfar nitna bo Daniel, shenemar v'nei fritzei amcha yinasu la'amid chazon v'nichshalu. Right? The scofflaws of your people will make themselves high to fulfill a vision, and they will fail. Is there a greater failure from a Jewish perspective than Jesus? Shekol hanavim dibru shamelach goel Yisrael u'moshiam u'mekabetz nitchayim u'mechazek mitzvotam. And so all of the prophets have the common denominator that they are castigating Bnei Israel and trying to get them closer to the Geula. V'zeh garam na'aved Yisrael b'cherev. Right. And Jesus caused, whether it's his fault or not his fault, is irrelevant at the moment. But what he accomplished was the abject destruction of Bnei Yisrael and the terrible exile that we have. Ulahashpilam lachlifa Torah, it's to bring us down low for our Torah to be superseded by the New Testament. Lahatot rov ha'olam la'avod Eloha mibaladei Hashem, in order for the majority of the world, the dominant religion to this day is the largest religion, that is to worship God, a God other than Hashem Himself. Aval machshavot borei olam ein koach ba'adam la'asigan. But we can't understand God. Ki lo darkeinu drachav, v'lo machshavotenu machshavotav, v'chol hadvarim ha'elu shel Yeshua notzri. So everything that Jesus has accomplished, v'shel zeh Yishmaeli, and this Ismailite Muhammad Shamad Acharav, einan ela liyasher derech lemelech HaMashiach, dakein et ha'olam kulo la'avodat Hashem biyachad. Ultimately, this is how I can see now, the Rambam says, and how it's paving the way for the true Mashiach. Shene'emar ki azeh pochel amim safa b'ra likro kulam b'shem Hashem lo'avdo shechem echad. In other words, basically, Christianity, Islam, has turned the majority of the world, and there are those who argue now, by the way, just as that this is, in effect, even the Hindus will have co-opted the basic monotheistic idea, right, and claim that all their gods are just a manifestation of the primary God. But basically, this is in other words, that basically now you have this worldwide movement, a religious movement, that is, from their perspective, accept the monotheistic idea, so that when the Mashiach comes, it's a tweak. Right? In other words, and as someone, I won't say it's one of my Rabbi, it was not one of his, to my mind, his best quotes, so I won't say who was, but who mentioned, once said, in a discussion with Christians, that we all agree, right, the Messiah is going to come. The only question is it the first time or the second? Right? But, okay, but basically it's the same thing. Right? So that's what the Rambam is saying here. We're in that that for all of the terrible suffering that the Jewish people has had to go through over the course of the last 2 millennia, nevertheless, right, from God's perspective, I can see why. Right, if you will, if you're looking at the long game. Yeah.
Saying that Hindus got it from Christianity in the book, their hollow inheritance, they make the case, and that Christianity was influenced by Hinduism. Okay, could be, and whatever. I don't want to go that way. I wanted to talk about it. I want to talk about, there's so many different ways that we can go, but we only got 21 minutes. So now so having said this, right? So what did the Balei Tosfot do? So if you flip the page, you're now number 7, and the halakha that's brought is the following: Asur la'adam. Right? There are many different areas of halakha that we can look at, where there is the question of the interaction with non-Jews and the equivalence that's given to Christians, and then how did Jews throughout the centuries deal with it. Professor Yaakov Katz has an excellent work on the general topic of the title is escaping me for the moment. I'm sorry?
Exclusiveness and Tolerance.
Yes, thank you. Exclusiveness and Tolerance, excellent volume. It's a thin volume. I very much recommend it. So here the Gemara. I just chose this particular example because it leads to the most directly to a discussion about the nature of Christianity. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin says the following: Asur la'adam she'yaseh shutafut menachri. So it's forbidden to have a business partnership with a non-Jew, and again, non-Jew by definition means a pagan. Shema yitchayev lo shvua. Why? Because the assumption is that a certain percentage of business dealings are going to go south.
That's just a given. That's just a given in business relationships, and so then you're going to need to go to court with your partner, and the partner is going to have to take an oath, the same way that you're going to have to take an oath in court, right? So he will take his oath in the name of his deity. V'haTorah amra lo yishama al picha. And the Torah says that the name of pagan deities should not be heard through your mouth. In other words, you're causing the non-Jew indirectly to give allegiance and swear in the name of, take an oath in the name of the deity, and that's why it's usher to get into the partnership in the first place. Right? That's what the Gemara says. So now, what about Christians? Right? So was that kept in the time of the Gemara? Was it kept more in the breach? Doesn't matter. That's the halacha. So now the Balei Tosfot ask, well, what about us, right? And here, you can understand that without getting into business relationships with non-Jews, basically Jewish society in Crusader Europe would not exist. So how were they able to deal with that? So Rabbeinu Tam number 8 says, Omer mutar lekabel hamenu hashvua bizman hazeh. Right. So today, today it's permissible, and you can have their oath, even though it's a Christian oath. Bizman hazeh kulam nishba'im b'kedoshim shelahem ve'ein tofsim b'an elahut. So for the most part, he says, their oaths are not made in the name of Jesus, but rather in the name of some saint or another, and they don't view the saint as being a deity, and so therefore that's not a problem. And then he says, "Va'afa pi shema shemaskirin imahem shem shamayim." But they'll also say, in the name of God, or whatever the version is in the French vernacular of the, or perhaps Latin, I don't know, of the 12th century in France. Kavanatam ledavar acher, and they're thinking of the Trinity. Right? They're not thinking of our sense of God. Nevertheless, mikom makom ein zeh shem avodat kochavim gam dantam laoseh shamayim. Right? They are not thinking in deep theological terms at that moment, and they are, if you will, roughly what we might call the Judeo-Christian ethic and the like. And even if they are now saying in the name of God, and then they continue with the rest of the Trinity. Lo eshkechan da asur ligrom la'acherim l'shatef de b'nei Noach lo husharu. So he says, it's forbidden for us to be dealing with let's say the Trinity, but it's not forbidden for a non-Jew. Now the question is, how do I understand this idea of Rabbeinu Tam? Right? The simplest way of understanding is, if you will, the narrow definition of Rabbeinu Tam, is to basically say this halacha specifically, which we just mentioned before, lo yishama al picha, that you should not mention the name of the deity. That is what's not forbidden to the non-Jew. That's all. The whole question is, where am I? If the non-Jew is making an oath in the name of Jupiter, right? So then that is an isser. But if the non-Jew is making the oath in the name of the Trinity, that's not usher, because it's mentioned, but it's not the vision of the unity of God is not, the mention of that is not forbidden to the non-Jew. Okay, that's the if you will, the narrow definition. The wider definition, which the Ramah, whether that's what the Balei Tosfot understood or not, but the Ramah says it, is that the idea of speaking of a Trinity, right, is not a usher for a non-Jew. It's usher for us. It's even avodah zarah for us. But it is not considered to be avodah zarah for the non-Jew. Right? Because, think about it. If you were to speak to your, not just your average Christian, but if you were to speak to, the Pope, okay, and ask him, are you a monotheist? Just yes or no. Of course his answer would be yes. Right? And you say, well, what about the Trinity? And then, okay, the mystery of the Trinity, whatever it might be. But nevertheless, right, from their perspective, it's monotheism. And the halacha recognizes that as being monotheism from the perspective of a non-Jew. We are expected to have, if you will, a more rarefied type of monotheism, a more pure type of monotheism, where we cannot, so for a Jew to accept the Trinity, that would be avodah zarah for the Jew. But for the non-Jew, it's not avodah zarah. And since it's not avodah zarah, for them to take the oath in that kind of connection, so then it doesn't have that problem. So if you are viewing it in the broader sense, right, so then you're saying, okay, what about doing business with them? So the answer is again, well, that shouldn't be forbidden anymore, because you're not, they'll praise their version of God in that context. Okay, fine, they praise it. There's nothing inherently usher in that praise of doing that. So therefore, I can do the business with them, on right before Sunday, on Saturday night. I can do it business with them, before Easter, and I can do business with them before Christmas. That is all going to be permissible, right? With the possible exception of doing business with regard to particular ritual items. Okay, but other than that, that shouldn't be a problem. So that's the, if you will, taking the direction of the Balei Tosfot. The Meiri goes one step further. The Meiri is the outlier here, but he's a very important outlier. The Meiri, living in 13th century Provence, so he's deep in Christian society as well. So we are, in fact, this is when the antipopes are found in Provence, in his period. So he's saying the following: Umikol makom umot habdurot b'darchei hadatot uma'aminim b'mitziyoto yitbarach la'achduto. So those nations which have literally fenced themselves in, meaning they're defined by religious practice and believe in the existence of God and His unity, meaning they are monotheists, v'yicholto, and His dominion in the world. Even though they get some things wrong. I mean, if you want to say, if you ever made a book called Classic Understatements of Rabbinic Literature, there it is, right? Even though they have some minor misunderstandings as to the concept of monotheism. But nevertheless, right? But they're basically monotheists. Ein lehem makom b'dvarim elu. He says this in many different places. So all of the halachot dealing with avodah zarah does not apply to any of the major Western religions. Doesn't apply to Christianity, doesn't apply to Islam, because they basically they view themselves as offshoots of Judaism. And even though they're viewing themselves as superseding us in certain instances, or it's the true prophet in other instances, nevertheless, they're accepting the core ideas of Judaism. They are not Ovdei Avodah Zarah. They are monotheists, and we have problems with them, but that is, nevertheless, understand that all of the halachot that are found in the Gemara dealing with our relationship with the pagan world don't apply to Christians, don't apply to Muslims. A very broad statement of the Meiri. I want to stress it is the outlier. It's a minority approach. Right? You have basically three approaches here that I've laid out amongst the Rishonim. On the one extreme is the Rambam, who basically says, when it comes to Christians, there's nothing to talk about. It is a full equivalence between Christians and Avodah Zarah. With regard to, on the other extreme, you have the Meiri that says they are full monotheists. And in between is this approach of Rabbeinu Tam and the Balei Tosfot that are viewing it, and even there are a couple of ways of understanding it, to the extent that basically from our perspective, their practices are Avodah Zarah, but from their perspective, they are not Ovdei Avodah Zarah. Okay, that's the spread, if you will. So now what about going into into churches and the like? Okay, so basically if you take either the Rambam approach or you take the Balei Tosfot approach, it's usher, because again from their perspective it's not Avodah Zarah, but from my perspective it is. So I can't go into a Beit Avodah Zarah, right? So it's usher. If I take the Meiri approach, so then it should be permissible. Okay, so now to what extent is this understood? So in some of these shitot, it is quite extreme. Take a look at the tour. Right, so this is now written in the beginning of the 14th century, and he quotes an earlier source, the Rabbi, who lived in Barcelona, and he says the following. Right, and anyone who's visited there knows how many churches are throughout Spain. ומשום ההחתמה דחשדה אפילו ישראל הדר בעיר שיש בה אליל אסור ללך לרחוב שאליל שם. Getting back to our opening halacha, so he says that it's forbidden to go on a street where there is a church. אותו רחוב פתוח לשווקים אחרים, if that is a cul-de-sac. In other words, if it's just the main marketplace, right, where most of the time the major cathedrals of the cities were built in large public areas, so that's one thing you're going through. But if you are going specifically down the alleyway to where that church is, and you're going to visit someone, it's usher, because you're going to that locale. And he says the following, Ve'efsher afilu al iskei rabim, just to skip to where the bold print, Ve'afilu al pikuach nefesh asur likanes l'sham. Even to the extent of pikuach nefesh, in other words, it's a form of, it's to go into the church. He's saying it's usher because it gives the impression of you're worshiping, right? So it's an expansion of Avodah Zarah, and the general halacha of Avodah Zarah is that one of those three things that we all know is yehareg v'al ya'avur, and even doing the expanded version, without getting into those halachot right now, is forbidden, right? Whether it's arayot or whether it's avodah zarah, so this would be included. So according to the Rashba, this is as far extreme understanding, but that it would be usher to go into a church if you might be giving the impression that you are accepting Christianity in some way. It would be, even if it's to save your life. Even for Pikuach Nefesh. What? Right. Because what is the Rabbanan? It's the Gemara's example with regard to Arayot is that if to embrace a married woman who's not your wife, if that is what it would be forbidden, and you would have to give up your life if the guy is forcing you to do it. Right, so that's the extent. What's called abizarayu de arayot is the term that the Gemara uses, and so this would be abizarayu de avodah zarah. Right, so even if that embrace, and the Gemara goes further than that, but I'm just saying the point is that these things that are yehareg v'al yavar, we take it seriously. Okay, so this is what the Rashba says. That is the extreme position. Most Rishonim don't accept it, and in fact the Torah's father, the Rosh, in his tshuva, and this is the way the Torah also holds. I'm just bringing the Rashba as the extreme. So the question is, can you run into a church and declare sanctuary? right? You're being chased by the mob, so you run into the church and you say sanctuary, and the church is going to the protection of the church will save you. So the Gemara had said that it's forbidden if you are need some kind of remedy, and the remedy is the fruit of an Asherah tree, a tree of Avodah Zarah. It's usher to eat the Asherah fruit in order to save your life. So here, that's what the Rush is comparing it to. I'll just say it outside so we can get to some of these other halachas because we're really running out of time. So the Rush says that so it's different than the Asherah tree, because the Asherah tree is if I eat the fruit, so maybe I'll start thinking that the Asherah has powers. Whereas I understand that this is sociological, sanctuary is sociological, and I'm not going to become a Christian because the church gave me sanctuary. So so you're allowed, anyone who is concerned, you're allowed to go into a church in order to save your life. Okay? Fine. So then the question now becomes, well, for other reasons, right? Well, there are those, by the way, I'm not going to read the Taz inside, but the Taz basically says it's forbidden to go in. It's not so clear, according to some Shitot, and he explains the Rashba, the Asherah. If you want to look at it, you'll see. What about going into a church today for non-religious reasons? Okay, primarily for most of us, it's going to be a question of tourism. But there are so we can say I've got to differentiate between going in service time, not service time, right? So at the I had a problem with, as I mentioned, the Pantheon. I didn't realize that it's an active Catholic church, or churches actually. Right? I went into the Pantheon on a visit about a decade ago with my family, and then there, you see the services going on. I said, okay, glad we got in without knowing, right? So that, because it's very going into the Pantheon is an issue as well. So but what about the question of going in for so here is a tshuva of Rabbi Yosef with regard to a Israeli diplomat being present at a church service for some official an official role, whether it's a coronation or it's a state funeral, etc., that's going on in the church. And Rabbi says it's usher. Rabbi says it's usher for the diplomat to go, right? Yes, right. So it is well known, right, that and this is a psak that goes back at least 150 years, that the chief rabbi of the UK, of England, so will attend various church services when necessary.
Wait it outside.
So some have done different things, and different. I'm sure someone's written about it. The history in terms of the actions of each particular chief rabbi and the like. I'm not familiar with it. If anyone knows of something that I would, please send it my way. I would love to read a study of it. But it's known as the psak of the chief rabbinate, which has also been accepted by the Beis Din. In other words, there's no split in this regard between the Beis Din in England and the chief rabbinate. It's the standard accepted psak, and many other, recently. So Rabbi Haskell Lookstein went to the church service and for Obama's inauguration. There are different, and it inspires some debate each particular time. Both opinions are understood. Both opinions are accepted, as the machloket is there. And the question frequently boils down to is, which Ravadia says there is no diplomatic worry, right? No need to worry about enmity under these circumstances, right? And obviously the the counter argument is that there is a great deal to worry about, and that's really a question of, okay, how do you view it? In other words, they're all accepting the psak of the Rosh. They're not, namely, that you can go in for pikuach nefesh. The question now becomes, given the circumstance, is this really pikuach nefesh? Was if you have and it could be that you could say the chief rabbi going in is very important. If the Israeli ambassador goes in, it's less important, right? How much is there actually going to be a pushback because of that? So every particular case has to be viewed under those circumstances. With regard, though, now to the going in for tourism, say, right? So it's understood, according to the majority of poskim, right, that again, either if you're a Rambamist or you are one following the psak of the Balei Tosfot, it's going into a house of Avodah Zarah. And then it becomes a question, is it an active church or not an active church? Some of you may be familiar with the famous, which has become a famous story of Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal, where he took a tour of the Vatican, and was under the impression that the Sistine Chapel was not an active church, and so was on the line to go into the Sistine Chapel when the guide talked about how services are held there twice a year, right? And so Rav Lichtenstein asked to bypass the chapel and was told that he couldn't, right, because of the way it worked. So he said, well, but I need to go to the bathroom. Right, so they pointed him to the to the restrooms, and then he rejoined the group afterwards. Okay, that was so that's an example of accepting it, and Rav Moshe has a psak. If that's source number 14. Don't have time to read it, unfortunately, inside. That is as I said, that's the mainstream psak, and which would mean. Right, so if a church has been decommissioned by non-Jews, so it's the equivalent of Avodah Zarah, which has been decommissioned by the pagan themselves, right? So then it's permissible to go in. So in many, just my own experience. So in a trip to Toledo in Spain, right? So there are something like about 50 churches in the city. It's a relatively small city, but there are 50 churches in the city. Only 4 of them at this point are active, right? And 2 of the inactive churches, one is the Jewish Museum, because it was a synagogue that was saved. Most of the synagogues were destroyed after 1391 and 1492, and this was saved to become a church, right? It's been decommissioned and now is the Jewish Museum. And the other is also is still owned by the church, but is no longer an active church. It's also a shul, and is a Jewish tourist site. And some people. Then there's another question: can you give money when you know the money is going to the church? Another shaila. All of these things are related, but. So to go into a inactive church, meaning a church which not that it's inactive at the moment that you're going, but rather that it is no longer being used as a house of worship, so that is less problematic. Here it's important to know with regard is the psak of Rav Rabinovich, and this particular shaila tshuva was sent to my son-in-law. Was the question. So he just writes the following: Niskarti shlifnei kama shanim zachiti lishtatev b'chabur shel Rosh Hayeshiva mishnat Torah l'Rambam v'harav amar shehu savur she'achen hanotzrim miyamenu or biyamenu perhaps einam ovdei avodah zarah v'lachen mi'ikar adin ein isur likanes l'knesiya. So he said, I remember Rav Rabinovich saying in a shir that he doesn't feel that he accepts the position of the Meiri. And so therefore that it's not forbidden to go into a church and pursue. But nevertheless, there is a long and very ugly history between Jews and Christians. And we should keep that in mind as well. In other words, it's not just the aesthetics in terms of the church art, but to understand when I stand in front of Notre Dame, right, and I see the sculptures on the facade of the church, which are anti-Jewish polemics in terms of the sculptures themselves. And I know that either this is the place where the Talmud was burnt in 1242, or this is where the decision was made, and it was, within a short walk is where the Talmud was burnt. And to be going into Notre Dame is basically a slap in the face to all of those Jews throughout all of those generations that had to live to it. Whether or not, even if halachically it is mutter, right, to be using that as a tourist site, that is something, right, to be taken into account. So this is the Rav Novitz's tshuva. Zacharta nechona. You remembered correctly. So even though they're not of the avodah zarah, nevertheless, one should distance oneself from things which are ugly, or worse than ugly, repugnant, and things that are like it. Ulam im yesh tzorech mamash, lo rak sakranut. So if you have a real need, so for example, you are an art historian. For example, you are studying architecture. You need to be making a study of these churches for your professional needs. B'cholov, so mutali kanes, then it's permissible. But he stresses lo rak sakranut, not just out of a curiosity, not just as a tourist. B'cholafin tzarich shakol yashar lachlit ma'u tzarich amiti. Okay? But every person has to be honest with themselves as to what is a real need. Okay?
Christians of our day, what's the distinction that he's making?
I think that the distinction that he's making is that even if you want to argue, I'm putting words in his mouth. I'm just giving, this is me, not Rav Rabinov. Is that that even if you want to say that medieval Christians were of the avodah zarah, right? That modern Christians, certainly in the after Vatican II and the like, and and everything that has happened, with the relationships that we have with the various Protestant denominations, etc. So over the course of the last, at this point now, 60 or so years. So that is fundamentally different than what Christians were. Their beliefs have changed. In other words, if if you read it's the extreme right wing of Catholicism today holds on to the beliefs that were mainstream for Catholicism 150 years ago. And so, as a result, the Christians of today, even if you felt that the Meiri was wrong then, right? But the principle of the Meiri was correct, and it's a question of the application, and that you can apply the principle of the Meiri today, even if, when the Meiri wrote it, you couldn't apply it. Right? That's, as I said, this is my interpretation of Rav Rabinovich. It's not something that, to the best of my knowledge, that's written somewhere. It might be written somewhere, but it's not. It's my interpretation, and that's the why he makes the distinction. But it's important to stress that this is, and we didn't get to other things which are important, going to mosques and going into an airport chapel, multi-faith chapel, etc. I apologize for another time, but it's important to stress that, to the best of my knowledge, Rav Rabinovich is the, if you will, the liberal, if you want to call it liberal, but is the Makil outlier amongst the poskim. So if you talk, the very fact that Rav Lichtenstein would think about going to the Sistine Chapel, that makes him okay already towards the Makilim. But he drew the line at an active church, whereas Rav Rabinovich is willing to talk about going into an active church, but at the same time, not as a simple tourist, right? I will just say, and I apologize. I forget I can't say it. Anyone who wants to hear what I will just say, so after the shir. So
what about talking about pikuach nefesh for yourself?
Yeah.
What about pikuach nefesh for somebody else? Meaning, somebody is dropped